What I'm about to say sounds pretty dramatic, but it's also very true. If it wasn't for Polk Audio, then there would be no Zero Fidelity. And I say that because when I was younger, I was really passionate about music, but I didn't really care so much about sound. That is until one day I brought home these huge set of Polk Audio towers. And for a couple years, I was really happy with them. But then one day I asked myself, I wonder what else is out there. And that is when I discovered the big, wide, and wonderful world of audiophile solutions. In fact, my very first audiophile purchase was a set of Polk Audio LSI9 bookshelf speakers. And you could say that's the whole thing that kickstarted my journey and what's led to where I am today. So it's only fitting that I go full circle by talking about the latest entry into the Polk lineup, the Legend series, particularly the L100 compact monitors. Let's roll that intro. Alright, so here it is, and as usual, before I talk about the performance, I'm going to briefly summarize what you get with this speaker. So, diving straight on in, the L100 is the latest entry into the new Legends lineup by Polk Audio. They retail for $1,200 a pair, and even though they're new speakers, they can trace their lineage all the way back to the original LSI7 bookshelf loudspeaker that was introduced nearly 20 years ago. And God, does that make me feel old, because I remember when the line was originally launched. So if you're not familiar with Polk Audio's LSI line, think of it like this. Polk Audio has been known as being this mass market loudspeaker manufacturer, and that's because a lot of their products can be found in retail stores like Best Buy. So when Polk Audio launched the LSI line, that was their way of saying that, hey, no, we can still produce a high-end speaker and nonetheless offer it at a reasonable cost, and what you're looking at is the third generation of that concept. So that leads me to the product itself. So with the L100, you're going to be getting a compact two-way rear-ported monitor. Up top, we are going to have a 1-inch ring radiating tweeter. And the interesting history behind this is Polk Audio has always used a ring radiator in some form with the LSI, LSIMs, and now the Legend series. They were also the first company to offer the ring radiator in a commercial mass market production line with the original LSI series. And since then, they've heavily modified this design, and what you're looking at now is more Polk Audio than anything you can buy off the shelf. They worked really hard to eliminate pretty much any resonances within the design of the driver. You have that thin face plug now. This is going to help to lower distortion to offer better dispersion from the driver, and it's important to note that it's made out of a softer plastic material and not metal, and that's to prevent people from having to go to the emergency room because they got a little bit too pokey with the tweeter there. Anyways, moving on, we are going to have a 5¼ inch woofer. They call it the turbine woofer due to the unique look, and most of you are going to want to know what is going on there. So these bumps are designed to break up waves across the cone. Now overall, the material is going to be very rigid, yet still low mass enough to be responsive to current. So overall, it's going to be similar to the LSI line, but improved. And that's going to be the whole story about this speaker. Now let's take a look at the back. So on the back, you are going to notice this unique device. So what this is a power port, and this is technology that Polk Audio has been using for, over 20 years now. And there's going to be two primary functions behind it. Number one is to eliminate port chuffing, because whenever you have a small speaker, especially when it's outputting a lot of bass, oftentimes ports are going to generate noise, which is going to sound like poop. So this is designed to not only help eliminate port chuffing, but it's also designed to give you a more even-keeled bass response regardless of where you have the speaker in the room. So if you have to place it next to a wall boundary, you're still going to get good, consistent bass response. Beneath that, we are going to have a set of high-quality 5-way binding posts, and that's going to be it, guys. So now it's finally time to talk about how it sounds. Alright, so normally this is my favorite part of the review because this is when I dive straight into telling you what the performance of the product is like. Only this time around, I'm going to have to shake things up a bit because I realize there are two types of people who are watching this video right now. The first is going to be those of you who are familiar with the Polk sound, specifically the LSI series, and then there's going to be the rest of you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break down this evaluation into two sections. The first is going to be dedicated to Polkies, and then the second is going to be dedicated to everyone else. So first up, to the Polkies out there who own or have owned a set of LSI or LSIMs, you may be wondering what's the major difference between those speakers and the new Legend series. So think of it like this. It's like Polk Audio took the LSI DNA and injected it with a sound that's much more open and modern and hi-fi sounding. Now when you sit back and you listen to any of the Legend speakers, you're going to notice some familiar traits. The bass and the lower mid-range is going to have that familiar, warm, muscular presentation that you're used to with the LSI series, but once you go beyond that, that's when things begin to change. Starting with the upper mid-range, it is going to be thinner sounding, and then you have the treble, which is going to be a lot different. The treble is now going to be boosted up, it's going to be sharper, it's going to be more spacious and airy sounding, it's going to be more detailed and refined sounding, but with the good comes the bad. On the good side, the performance ceiling on the new Legend series is going to be higher, which means when you throw a good recording at them, they're going to sound exceptional. However, they're more revealing sounding, which means they're now no longer going to be as forgiving of poorly recorded material. The speakers are also going to be much more dynamic sounding than the outgoing LSI series. So overall, what you're dealing with is something that still has that classic Polk Audio sound, only now it's evolved into something that has more of that high-end presentation. So anyways, guys, that's it for the comparison. Now it's time to address those of you who probably haven't understood a word that I've said so far. So yeah, let's get to the next section. Okay, so I'm not sure what you were able to pick up on from the previous section, so here's the bottom line. The L100 is a compact, dynamic, spacious sounding speaker that has a very distinct character. It's not going to be for somebody who's looking for this rolled off and smooth sounding top end, nor is it going to be for somebody who's looking for an accurate sounding studio monitor. Instead, it has a very distinct voice, and that leads me to its character. Overall, you're going to notice that this speaker takes on a very lively tone. The top end is going to be boosted, the upper mid-range is going to be thin, the rest of the presentation is going to take on this warm and meaty character to it, and it's going to project sound in a forward way. In other words, when you're sitting back and you're listening to these speakers, you're going to notice that it sounds like the presentation is just in front of the physical location of the speakers, which I think is a pretty good middle ground when it comes to projecting sound into the room. Now, let's go into more detail, starting with the treble. So the treble, as I mentioned before, is on the forward side of neutral. It is going to be bumped up. However, it's not going to take on this bright and edgy tone. And if anything, it is effortlessly detailed, if not even refined sounding. It actually sounds like a proper high-end speaker. The spaciousness around the notes in particular, that detail, is absolutely exceptional for something at this price class. But with the good comes the bad. This is a revealing sounding speaker in the top end, which means if you listen to a great sounding recording, you're going to be treated to sound that is absolutely fantastic for the money. However, the opposite is true when you throw a bright and thin sounding recording on these speakers, then that's exactly what you're going to get. It does not put a band-aid over poor sounding electronics and or recordings. So that's what you're going to get with the top end, more of an input-output situation, except now it's just going to be boosted. That leads me to the mid-range. So the upper mid-range is going to take on a distinctly thin character, which is pretty common with a lot of monitors nowadays. On one hand, that gives the speaker a great sense of depth. On the other hand, vocals, particularly female vocals, will sound just a little bit pinched, as they do with most other monitors. However, once you get to the rest of the mid-range, that's where the character starts to shift a bit towards the warm and meaty side of neutral, which is kind of interesting because now when you listen to more rock and roll music, electronic, and something that requires some meaty tone within the mid-range, you still get that, making the speaker pretty versatile when it comes to the kind of music that it can sound good with. Now, let's talk about the bass. So the bass is going to be very strong, and it's not going to be about how low it can go. It's instead going to be about power handling. I mean, this is a speaker that can get pretty loud, and best of all, because of the power port, you can place it next to a wall and you don't have to worry about boominess. Now, the bass isn't going to be the quickest low end in the world, but it's still going to be strong and enjoyable. Now, let's talk about dynamics. So this is going to be something that's really enjoyable about this speaker, and that's going to be its dynamic power. It can start and stop on a dime, and it can transfer a whole lot of energy. So if you listen to percussion, I mean, yeah, this is a small speaker, but given its size, it's pretty impressive how much energy it can transfer. It's not quite visceral, but you can tell it's getting there, which I think is just very impressive for something of this size and price. Moving on, let's talk about imaging. I mean, come on. It's a small monitor. Of course, it's great with imaging. It'll lay down a wide sound stage with great focus in between the speakers. It's going to take on slightly of a holographic character. I'm starting to mess up my sentence here. But this is actually going to be kind of different for me because most of the LSI speakers, they didn't really do this. So this is going to sound more like a proper high-end monitor in that regard. Now, let's talk about equipment matching. So the first thing that I want to address is the specifications. So this speaker is supposed to be a 4 ohm nominal load, and I forgot what the power sensitivity is, but I think it's around 86 dB, and this would make you think that it's only going to sound good with muscular amplifiers, but that's not the case. In fact, on a Luxman 10 watt per channel EL84 tube amp, this speaker sounded great. In fact, I could even take it to pretty loud volumes, so I don't think you need a lot of power. Instead, it's all about having a quality power supply. So if you're in a small room, 10 watts is all you really need. I think for most people, 50 to 60 watts is going to be fine. And if you listen at louder volumes, that's when you may need to step into the 80 or 100 territory. So it's a little more efficient than its specs would suggest. Now, when it comes to the kind of gear that it sounds good with, I think it's a lot more sensitive to this than the previous generation of LSI series. Because of its voicing, I would suggest pairing it up to gear that's either neutrally voiced or something that's warm and rolled off sounding. An example would be the Yamaha 806 integrated amp that I reviewed. That would be a fantastic match. Another good starting point would be the Marantz PM8006. I don't recommend pairing it up to super affordable gear just because most of that gear has rough sounding treble. It's usually a little bit thin, and that's just not going to make for a great match with these speakers. I mean, they really do scale well and they respond to high quality components. So it's just something for you to be aware of. Otherwise, guys, that's about it. The last thing I think I have to talk about is the music listening experience. And look, that's one of the things I like about Polk Audio products. Whenever I'm evaluating them, it doesn't matter if it's the least expensive product or something from their flagship line. I know that I can go to my music collection, throw anything on the system, and I'm going to be in for a good time. The only difference with these speakers is that because of the voicing and because of their revealing nature, I know I can't listen to the worst recordings and get away with it. And that leads me to the caveats. Okay, so for this section, I have 3 things I want to go over with you all, starting with the first and most obvious, which is not everyone's going to take to the sound of the L100s, and that's because not everyone wants a lively sounding top end with a thin sounding upper mid-range and warmth throughout the rest of the presentation. On top of that, these are fairly revealing speakers. I mean, no, they're not brutal in nature by any means, but still, if you listen predominantly to bright and thin sounding recordings and or you own a fairly unrefined or bright sounding gear, then there's a good chance that these speakers are just not going to be a good match for you. Moving on, even though these are powerful speakers for their size, guys, you need to be realistic. They're not going to sound like a big set of towers, so just bear that in mind if you decide to try them for yourself. And then lastly, and more subjectively, I realize there's going to be plenty of people out there who are just not going to be a big fan of the aesthetics, and then there's also going to be a fair number of people who are just not going to be a fan of the idea of dropping over $1,000 on a pair of mini monitors that have the Polk badge on front. It is what it is, right? Anyways, that's just it for the caveats, and that leads me to my final thoughts. Alright, so to wrap this up, on an objective level, I think the L100 is a very competent all-around mini monitor. There's going to be a lot of traits that I think people are going to find attractive. I mean, it's compact, it's powerful, it sounds good at low volumes as well as high volumes. It's dynamic, it's spacious sounding, it has a lively character that possesses great detail and refinement, while at the same time having warmth and richness throughout the rest of its presentation. On top of that, it's pretty easy to position within a room. I mean, you don't need to spend hours, days, or weeks trying to find the exact spot in your room that's going to make these speakers sound good. In fact, if you're tight on space and you need to put them on a literal bookshelf or against a wall, you can do that and they're going to sound just fine. Now, clearly, they're not going to be for everyone. Not everyone's going to like the voicing and not everyone's going to be able to afford them, and that's perfectly okay. And that leads me to my subjective thoughts. So, subjectively speaking, I do like these speakers. I like the fact that, like with most Polk Audio products, they handle a wide genre of music very, very well. And I also like its overall sound and the direction that Polk is taking. Something that retains some of that warmth and that richness, but now they're finally starting to grow up and offer that kind of high-end sound, that kind of insight that makes for a proper high-end listening experience. Now, I do have some complaints. I do wish that the upper mid-range was just a little bit fuller, and I wish that the price of these speakers was down to $999 a pair instead of $1,200 a pair. Not that I think that they're overpriced, it's just there's a lot of competition at that price point. In fact, I'm going to have a comparison for you guys at the end of this video for those of you who are interested, but the bottom line is this. I do think it becomes more of a niche solution at $1,200 a pair, but that's just going to be my take on it. And guys, as always, I appreciate you watching, and until next time, peace. Alright, I know how much some of you guys love comparisons, so for this bonus section, I'm going to take the Bacart Audio S300 Mark IIs and tell you about how they stack up to the Polk Audio L100s. And this is going to be an interesting matchup because these speakers both retail for around the same price at $1,200 a pair, yet they're very different from one another. I mean, the Bacart speakers are much bigger, and they were designed to be given room to breathe and to be treated like a proper high-end speaker, whereas the Polks are a lot smaller and they're designed to work better in tight spaces and even next to wall boundaries. Still, despite that, there's going to be some pretty remarkable differences between them, and who they're going to appeal towards is just going to depend on the individual. Starting with the Bacarts. So the Bacarts, unsurprisingly, are going to be the fuller sounding speaker. There's going to be a lot more bass. It's going to be deeper, stronger, and even quicker sounding than what you get on the Polks. But the compromise is that you have to give them room to breathe, because if you don't, then they're going to start to sound a little bit more boomy. Thus, the Polks are going to be more flexible in terms of controlled bass output. Next, let's talk about the mid-range. So the mid-range on the Bacarts, I would say, is ultimately going to be superior because it's fuller sounding, a little bit more tonally accurate. There's going to be a better sense of scale just due to the size of the woofer and the size of the speaker. And overall, it's just going to be more realistic. And then we go to the top end. So this is where there's going to be a huge polarizing difference. The top end of the Bacart is fairly smooth sounding, meaning that you can listen to fairly poor recordings through the speaker and still enjoy the listening experience, whereas the Polk is going to be completely different. It's going to be a lot more lively, more spacious, more detailed, and more refined sounding. It's just going to give you more of a proper high-end presentation in the top end. Now, the compromise is that it's not going to be as friendly sounding as the Bacart. So as always, it's just a matter of determining what's best for you. When it comes to imaging, I'm going to have to give it to the Bacarts. They will lay down a wider sound stage, and they also sound better in the off-axis, which means as you move around the room, these speakers are going to outperform the Polks. However, the Polks are going to be a little bit more forward in nature. So the Bacarts are a little bit more laid back, whereas the Polks make it sound like the presentation is taking place just a little bit closer to your listening position, which is something that you may prefer. And then there's going to be dynamic range. Even though the Polks are smaller, I would say that they're the more dynamic sounding speaker. And when you listen to things like percussion, that's really when you're going to notice the difference. Otherwise, the biggest difference is going to be the fact that Bacart is a consumer direct company. You buy them directly from Denmark, whereas Polk is going to be a global company and you buy it through distributors and or dealers. So anyways, guys, that's going to be the wrap up. Hopefully you found that interesting. And yeah, for real this time, thanks for watching and peace.